You're on.
Okay. Welcome back, folks. This is your local flying squirrel here, and we're going to talk today about terraces. Um, terraces, to me, they're one of the solutions um, in the world of agriculture. And a lot of the times, a lot of the times in our community, we're so focused on all these problems. And so to kind of reflect on some of the key solutions, and in the past, we've spoken about soil remediation, water remediation, phytoremediation, and all these kind of techniques that we can use to help the environment we're in. And yet, there's this ancient technique that's been around for thousands of years. So, we're going to talk about that. And doing research, everyone's kind of saying the Incas invented terracing. And we know that the Incas were actually a tribe or people or civilization that came to being after the warrior culture, and this was by several hundred years. So that the Incas created terracing when we actually have several thousands of years worth of history going back to Babylon, and the gardens they had beautiful gardens back then. So we've seen terracing back into antiquity in the Mediterranean. We see it all over Asia, and we also see it in the Andes. So we don't need to say that it was invented in the Andes. We can say that they really mastered it in the Andes. Um, and when you think about what a terrace is, it's basically a way to keep erosion from happening on a hillside that you plan on farming. Whereas if you're not going to build a terrace, you're going to have tremendous erosion of your soil. The second you put any fertilizers down, they're going to get washed off in the first rain. And terraces is one of the best ways to slow the water down and sink it into your hillside. And it's also a great way to direct water and flow it you want it to. So in the Incas, they've done just a tremendous job, and we're going to go through some pictures that I have from them, and understanding that the Incan economy was based on farming. In this last picture, you can see the steps they built in with the terraces. So they were very forethoughtful in their design, and this was a way that they could convert completely near impossible agricultural land to being highly productive for their people. And it's a really interesting concept that the Incans had. They're a very socialist type civilization. And now we're talking about the Incas, not necessarily the warriors, because it's much easier to get information on the Incas, because they're still doing it to this day. But one of their, being that agriculture was their main source of economic activity, um, is really just the sedentary part of their life. It was just the way their life revolved was very based on agriculture. Um, and it's really important to consider that they actually broke up their farms into three sections, or they divided their crops into three sections. The first section was given to the emperor, and that was basically given to the emperor. Obviously, he used what he needed for him and his troops, but then he also took the reserves and stored them and redistributed them. Um, you can see how steep these hillsides are. This, I believe, this is in Bolivia. This picture I'm posting right now. The second form of distribution for the crops was actually to the priest class. So the first third went to the emperor, the second third went to the priests, and the third went to the peasants. And the peasants were the foundation of this empire. If the peasants weren't, fed and happy, then they weren't going to get as much done. However, they did do incredible sacrifices. Um, so keeping in mind, I don't know if they were sacrificing all of their own people or if they were sacrificing foreign tribes that they were conquering. And I'm sure they did have lots of endangered, lots of slaves. Some of the crops that they were growing in this techniques could have been potatoes, tomatoes, coins, peppers, peanuts. In some elevations, they're growing maca. This picture is also in Bolivia. Now, this is Machu Picchu. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this. Lots of agriculture was taking place here. And when you think about it, this is the top of the mountain. And anytime you're doing terracing, you start from the bottom and you work your way up. So, not necessarily the bottom of this mountain was where this specific terrace started, but keeping in mind that that's how you build terraces from the bottom up. And um, we're at the top of a mountain. So, in some sense, there's lots of trails and terraces and pathways that connect all this. And when you think about the amount, excuse me, the amount of rain that a place like Machu Picchu gets in a season, it's just incredible. So the ingenuity they had to make sure that that mountain didn't wash away. Um, I believe they did quite a bit of sacrificing up in this area. So it wasn't just for agriculture, but you can imagine what this place would have looked like, um, fully planted out, not just with grass. Here's another example of painting some of the terraces. That's a pretty awful picture. Sorry about that. So this is one of the ingenious ways that they built their terraces, and this is they would have started this at the very bottom, and the top layer would have been your topsoil. The next layer would have been more of a gravel, and then under that would have been excuse me, would have been the bedrock and large rock that you would have harvested during the construction. And when you think about the manpower that these operations took, it is probably very significant and very skilled techniques and like the forethought that had to go into all this is just incredible. So this picture kind of shows as the water would come in on the terrace, it would percolate through the topsoil, through that next layer, into the rock layer, and then it would slowly work its way into the mountain. And really, depending on what's the underneath that, which is bedrock, that water is going to just slowly work its way in and down the hillside. And this is another kind of cross section of it. Just ingenious. There's places. So here's a great picture. This is Machu Picchu, and this shows. I believe this is Machu Picchu. So this is the ingenious part of it. This is when. So getting 80 inches of rain in a year, you're gonna have so much water, and when you have all those flat surfaces, they're basically water harvesting plains. So the water has to go somewhere. And if anyone's been up to Machu Picchu, it doesn't look like there's much room for that water to go anywhere. Um, okay, I'll keep going. So this is just those blue dots kind of show where that water is going to go and escape to, and it just shows they're really insightful. As I was saying, the Incas were tremendously productive agriculturally. And if you think about, where their empire would have been and how much land they would have been, kind of working with, it would have been from sea level all the way up to 15,000 feet. So what we're looking at right here is a giant garden site, and this is how they mastered agriculture is what we're looking at right here. So each terrace represents a different climate. In in Peru, they have I think Fred, correct me if I'm wrong, they might have 120 different microclimates. And you could imagine each terrace and if you go 10 feet to the left or 10 feet to the right, you're going to have a slightly different temperature, humidity, pressure. And so going down and coming up, this whole area would have been an experimental farming location. So they would have been trying new tomato crops, new potato crops, new bean crops. They would have been genetically, crossing species genetics, for a different region. And if they said we're building a new farm in this area, what do you know will grow there? And they can just go to this area and look. So just absolutely, when you think about how they achieved it, this was one of the keys to their success was this kind of experimental location. And I believe what they call it is vertical archipelago. And this picture here is basically showing that in Peru they have very high elevation all the way down to the seafloor, and each one of these gradients is a different climate that this would have been planted with. Then you go to the next slide, and we're going to see the different crops that will work at these areas. So if you're looking back at the terrace, this one, and you say, okay, well, corn grows great where my cursor is. Can we get corn to grow here? And which one is it? Can we get it to grow here? And which one is it? So it's really cool how they had that idea. And I can't think of any other place I've heard of that can achieve that. And looking at this elevation, you see how there's the potato is the highest growing crop. Well, maca is the next highest. So maca would grow up in this area. And it wouldn't have actually, there wouldn't have been pines where they're growing maca. It would have just been um, high desert, dry, absolutely intense climate to grow any crop. And the maca grows there amazingly. I believe it's even up to 14,000 feet. So just looking at this, obviously the sugarcane, bananas, and papaya grow great down in the Amazon in the Amazon basin. And then the coffee and the corn is going to be at your next level up. So it's just really cool to see. So this what we're looking at is when I said the peasants had a big productive year for their crop. 1/3 that they kept to themselves, and I'm not sure if the 1/3 they kept went into these. This is basically a food storage. They would keep. So here, I told you that to tell you this. The emperor was very generous with his people, apparently, and he would supply extra supplies to all these villages around the empire, and this was one of them. So you would have extra sandals, you'd have extra tools, you'd have extra bedding, and certainly you'd have extra food. And one of the things the Spanish conquistadors said when they got there was they couldn't believe their storage operations, their food storage, and just all their supplies. Here's another example of it, and it's built. It's just so gorgeous that they can build this stuff on such rugged terrains, and it's so functional. They're so intelligent about their buildings, and as I was saying, they were the best in agriculture at the time. They were also the best in keeping wool. So their alpaca genetics, their breeding that they did back then was so advanced that they had the best wool in the world. And they say they can't even duplicate it now because of, I guess, the lost art of the right genetics. So it's just really fascinating to see where this technology went, because we can look at the terraces from different parts of the world that we're about to look at, and you see it's the same concept, but the amount of detail and foresight is just incredible. So we're going to switch continents, and we're going to jump over to Africa. This is West Africa. This is the colonial era. These women are basically, I guess you'd call them slaves, but they're basically being forced to put in terraces. So because it was being forced upon them, they really hated it. And so their agriculture for many years after they were kind of done being colonized, they were all anti-terracing. And it's very fascinating because after that point, their agriculture went kind of down the hill, no pun intended. Their yields went down, and especially when you start including drought. When you have drought, terraces do a fantastic job holding more water in. And that was one of the things that they noticed in the modern day was the farms that had terraces had better yields and better crops than the non-terraces. And here's a picture of a group of ladies, villagers, all working in a, basically they're just digging a trench. The trench is going to fill with water, and they're dumping the soil uphill, and that's going to create a berm, and that's going to kind of act as the wall to the terrace. So there's many different ways to do it. They have very, looks like very red clayey soil there. This is an example of what those ladies were doing, digging that trench. So some people would say this looks more like contour farming, but you can kind of see that it has the remnants of a terrace in this picture. So what started off as this, over time, so the erosion from up here is going to flatten this out and come over here and make it look like this. And then you can kind of see the ditch also fills in. And this ditch right here that fills in is going to be, a nice wet spot. So if you wanted to, you can actually plant along here. You can plant along here. All like depending on your soil type and your slope depends on how high you want this slope to be. And some of the pictures we're going to see in Asia, they have just incredible slopes that are vertical, and they have soil texture that is conducive to that. But this is in Western Africa, and here's another example in Western Africa. So we see this all over the world. I don't know of anywhere that they're not doing contour or terrace farming. And like I said, the pictures of terrace farming versus non, for people in that area, they're all doing it, because it adds so much value. So we're going to jump over to the Mediterranean. Here's a classic example in the Mediterranean. We've seen gorgeous rock walls in the Mediterranean, olive terraces, citrus terraces, cork oak terraces. There's lots of crops that they grow in the Mediterranean, and these would have been very old. We see these from the Canary Islands. We see it all through the Mediterranean. We see it in Yemen. We see it in the Fertile Crescent. So, we see this in places that civilization has been there for a long time. This is like a pretty old, run-down looking terrace. And you can see it's just a very rocky area. And to build topsoil, you're going to want to, build a retaining wall and put whatever. It looks so rocky that whatever topsoil they have, they want it to stay there. And by putting it on the up of the right side of the terrace wall is how you're going to keep that stuff. Okay, we're going to move over to Asia. Most of this is going to be in China. Some of these are in the Philippines. These, I'm sure everyone's seen these. How they grow rice, but by no means that's not the only crop they grow. They do grow, I believe, barley, wheat, and what else? Barley and wheat. Same system here. This is really going to help these people. Rice needs to grow in water. It wants to grow in rather warm water. So they have this ingenious way of basically look at these terraces. They've sculpted an entire mountain for their agricultural benefit. And these people, at one point in time, these people all farmed and that was all they did. Now, there's probably some tourism going on. It's just such a wonder to behold. People come from around the world to see this stuff. So I'm sure it's kind of like helped, just their simple lifestyles helped them financially. And it's huge. You can see on the left here, this looks like a little water overflow. This looks like a little water overflow here. It's really cool. You can kind of follow where the terrace starts and where it connects to. There can be issues with these in torrential downpours if you're not managing the water flow. So there are pros and cons. In my opinion, there's more pros than cons, but there are things to just be mindful of. Another one, I believe this is the Philippines. More gorgeous. It's just incredible what humans can do. Um, I didn't get any pictures that I wanted to of the Gobi Desert, but there's some projects that they've done in China where they've actually turned the desert that looked like pure sand into an oasis. And these farming, this is just absolutely very steep land. This is the peak. Typically, this is where you'd be walking. You'd walk, like you can see a little path right on the peak, and you can see this terrace comes across here, goes here, comes wraps around the mountain, and comes over here. It's just amazing how these all wrap around the contour of the landscape. Whoops, did I skip one? Or these are just kind of beautiful. You look at one terrace, they're I could shoot terrace pictures all day, but this is just I just thought these were rather beautiful. Um, this looks like it's probably the wet season. It doesn't look like they're fully planted. Um, in the springtime, they typically, all the villagers come through and they manage them. They fix any the clay walls. They plow them. There's a traditional method for plowing inside. Lots of labor. It's very labor intensive to set up and to maintenance them. It's probably not terrible. And we spoke last week about Azolla. I don't see any Azolla in any of the terrace pictures I've looked at, but it certainly is a crop that a lot of people are doing. Here's more gentle sloping terraces. These aren't flat like the other ones where you can keep water. Um, when you look at this, the way you know the terrace is perfect is because the water's all right in here, and there's no way you could do that on this. See, this is not flat. So this is just another method of terrace farming. There's obviously a slope here and a berm along here. Okay, so now we're going to pivot into more of the regenerative model. Um, this is contour farming. This is not terrace farming. The way that they're altering their land here is more with a keyline plow, and that's basically a single hook that goes into the ground about 2 or 3 feet, I believe, and it rips the ground so where you're not turning soil, but you're allowing major water percolation to come in, and you rip your line on contour, and then you plant on contour. So in an agricultural model, the guy next door to this guy's farm, he has a I wish I would have had a picture of it, but it's basically a flat looking monocrop farm of a grain. It's wheat or what, but it's probably wheat out in this area. Um, you can see this is the same farm. The blue spots is where you would have your water. So you would start up here. The water would go this way. It would go this way on this contour. You create a pocket here for a pond, and then basically you're moving water from the valleys out to the ridges because the ridges don't have the water. That's why it's a ridge. The valley has the water. Water from the valley and move it towards the ridge. So that over here we got the valley, over here we got the ridge, and all this. So this is probably the high point of the property. So the water sheets here to this pond or sheets here. So it's all about moving water. It's really about slowing the water down. We want to slow it, spread it, and sink it. In an ideal setting, you would have these blue lines are your contour lines, and then you have your trees. So one of the things that we would like to see is a changing of the diet from the annual grains to annual plants. Perennial agriculture is kind of a winner. I think the ancient forests of North America, they say you could walk from the East Coast to the West Coast and never leave the canopy of the forest. And those would have been old growth, mature forests that would have been managed and manicured by the indigenous people of North America, the Indians of the North America. So they had regular burnings, and they had, but the thing is, the plants they planted, they used. So these were nut trees, and they harvested the nuts for protein. They harvested the bay nuts for a stimulant. So this when we're looking out here in the forest, these are hardwood trees. These trees serve a purpose, and it's interesting. What we're going to talk about later is, well, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So in an agricultural setting, you would have your trees planted there, and that would be your oaks to your berry trees, your apple trees, your whatever you're going to put in your orchard. You put it along your contour line, and you give space for other crops. So you could have annual crops here. You can also grow grass, so you could be grazing your animals in here. So here's another example. So you have your contour trees, and then you have about a 25-foot garden area, and all these are contour. So when the rain comes in, the water is staying in these contours and soaking in. And if there's typically in a high wet area, you would have a 1 to 2 inch drop per 100 feet of row. So from where my cursor is there to here, it's a 1 or 2 inch drop. And so from way out here to over here, it might be a 1 foot drop. It's still enough to move the water and slow it down. So this is silvopasture, so you can do the same thing. If you just wanted to grow, pine trees as your thing, you have a pine business, you could be now running cattle in between. You don't need to have just a monocrop. Now you have two crops. Same thing, two crops. Here's another one. So she has her nut trees, and she has all kinds of other plants growing in here. And if you're grazing your animals over here, and you have an electric fence, well, you can allow your animals to graze through this, and they're going to be eating medicinal herbs. They're going to be eating, the things that we call weeds, but are super good to them. So this is a really good example of how to do it. And this isn't, this looks pretty full. She is picking contour lines for these rows. But even if it's relatively flat, you can still pick your contour lines if it's relatively flat. If it's perfectly flat, it makes it a little difficult. And this is what a system like that would look like kind of early on. It looks like they've got some maybe grapes growing here and maybe some other trees growing here. These trees are probably going to be like your oaks, maybe something that's going to be a longer lifespan. And that's the thing with these models is planting. If you're trying to reestablish a meadow into a multi-species forest like that, what it used to be, because probably this used to not be a meadow 200 or 500 years ago. So we can change it back and still benefit. So if you're having a really awful year and you need more grazing, well, you can rip out a whole stretch here and let more animals graze. Or if the production of this is more valuable than the grazing, then you can plant another one. Along the way, your hardwoods are going to be so slow to grow, so you plant those spaced out, and then you have some nitrogen fixing beneficial cover bushes next to them, and then you have your orchard trees that you want in there. And the difference between this model and say putting in 100 apples of the same variety in this one line, this is going to get you maybe 20 apples, but it's also going to get you 10 oak trees and some chestnuts and some hickory and maybe a couple pines, and you're going to start reestablishing a forest. And your fruit tree might only live 50 years. Your nitrogen fixer might only live 10 years, but it's going to be feeding the system. Here's another one. This looks like corn in between some sort of nitrogen fixing. Actually, I can't tell what that tree is, but that's a beautiful example. Here's another example. This is kind of more of like home scale, backyard scale. This looks like some hugelkulturs. So what these people did is they buried logs, and then they sometimes what you can do is you excavate the soil out from the foot of your bed, and move that soil over here, and then you fill your trench with logs, and then you put your soil back on top of it. That's a hugelkultur, and a lot of people are hip on those. Here's another example of hillside farming with animals. Stupid picture. This is a real kind of human scale terrace contour farming. This is kind of what my last garden I had. We had a bunch of sloping garden spots, and I built you know a bunch of beds like this. Real easy, and I like it. I like doing things by hand because you can fix them by hand, and you don't need machines to come in and fix stuff. When you start getting like large earth moving operations, and you start using machines, sometimes you need machines to fix repairs. So I like the human scale. And this is just gorgeous. This looks like contour farming done out of just a beautiful way. I love this. This is probably one of my favorite, um, things to look at. So this is a garden from Sepp Holzer. He's the rebel farmer in Austria. So we've kind of gone around the world. We've seen the Andes, we've seen Africa, we've seen the Mediterranean, we've seen Asia, and now we're in the Austrian Alps. This guy is the master at terrace farming. He's transformed his landscape. This looks pretty human scale. This area, every land owner in this area monocrops their forest for pine, some sort of pine, maybe it's tree harvest. So they'll clear cut your land and sell it to the local mill, and everyone does it. And this guy, it's basically the law. And this guy won't do it. He refuses to do it. He hasn't done it forever. He bought old land, and he's the only guy in probably the whole area that's not doing it. And you can see here some of his terraces. And the yields he get from his are just incredible. Um, here's his method for the hugelkultur. Some people use the hugelkultur method to grow soil. So you could build a hugelkultur, and after 10 years, the wood inside is going to break down, and all this humus is just going to be amazing. So you could harvest this and move it somewhere else, or you could just leave it. So there's different contexts to using the hugelkultur. This is another method. How Sepp would do it is all this could be the flat part could be your production. So you could have your veggies or your wheat growing here. You could have this be your cover crops, and your animals can be grazing here. So it's important to remember that animals can graze on hillsides as long as it's the right species, right variety of animal. And you can really start getting a lot of utilization out of your hillside. So I want you guys to look. I'm going to go through these pictures, and I want you guys to just start thinking about what you see and what you feel, and what kind of emotions you start getting. So we're in the UK. This is the southern part of the island. These are just obviously the royalties of the day. So we're going to talk about the Shakespeare of gardens. His name is Lancelot Brown. All information I'm getting from is I learned from the Conspiracy Graduate channel. So if anyone's interested in kind of going down this rabbit hole, these guys have just done a bang up job. And yeah, his name was Lancelot Brown, but he went by the nickname of Capability Brown. He was born in 1715. And going back to these pictures, he is the creator of all these gardens. Nothing that you just saw is real, or I guess they're all real. They're 100% artificial. So none of this water, these ponds, this obviously is not original. These houses, I could almost guarantee most of these trees. Obviously, this bridge and this pond, not organic, built. Same thing here. So during this period of time, there's a huge transition taking place within the controllers of kind of our modern history. And we know history has been rewritten. Um, we know that they used literature. Most people back in these days, in the early days, maybe the 16 and early 1700s, a lot of people weren't literate. So they learned propaganda and they learned these ideas through literature and through, plays. So people would have learned a lot through these stories and they not necessarily would have read the story. So this guy was a landscaper, he was a gardener, and he was part of 170 of the finest country homes in that part of the world. And what he was responsible for is erasing all evidence of the medieval history of this part of the world. And it's just fascinating. To think about the natural environment that existed there for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, the history of the villages, the history of the people. And the really fascinating thing about this is a lot of our ancestors probably would have been from parts of the world that these estates took over. There's a very good chance that a lot of these estates were actually built on top of ancient pagan sacred sites. Maybe they're energy vortexes, ley lines, or what have you, but definitely pagan sites. Some of the cathedrals and the Gothic structures were clearly also part of that, built on top of sacred pagan sites. Um, but to think about everything we're looking at in this picture being artificial. So the stream, artificial. These trees, planted. These trees, planted. This lake, obviously, same thing. These oak trees, planted. This pine tree, planted. When we think of the history of gardens before that time, this is what we would have been looking at. Very geometric, um, lots of straight lines, big open boulevards. It would have been a completely different farming, gardening experience. This is one of my favorite pictures. Actually, no, this is it. Actually, this one might be a little better. This is what we would have been seeing um, agriculturally for quite a long time, probably maybe a couple hundred years. And what does this have to do with terraces? Nothing. But what it has to do is with the history of we saw in Asia those mountains that were completely altered to terraces, and now we're seeing the complete alteration of the history of farming now being changed into something completely different, something like this. So this is a map of one of Capability Brown's jobs. And when we think about the amount of earth that these guys moved, and here's the interesting conspiracy of it all, is it was an organized effort to eliminate the medieval evidence and artifacts of the old world. Basically the Gothic architecture, the medieval, all of it was to be removed and reshaped. And they moved mountains. Here's a very good. Let me make sure. Yeah. So look at this picture. This is the before. Here's the after. Before, after. So it's just, I mean, I could go back, look at how different they changed it, and it's hard to actually recognize. Um, so when we think about the amount of trees, every one of these trees we're looking at here was planted to look like a forest. As a matter of fact, in the art of the day, they were hiring painters to paint the forests as if they were fully grown. So they weren't even showing you the actual what it looked like back then. So they had a very countrywide effort to reshape and basically remove history. Um, when I watched this video, it made me think about, wow, how easy would it be now? So this meadow, when we think of this, we look at this and we say, that's the most natural, beautiful thing we've ever seen. The sheep are grazing, there's hunting land, the way your eye flows off this patio out here and it follows out here and you can look out here. It's unbelievable. 100% artificial. One of the things that they're famous for was creating basically rivers and lakes. Um, Virtually, this part of the country had a few waterways, ponds or lakes. Very few, very little, hardly any. One of the things they did to destroy the history was bury stuff under lakes. They would remove ancient structures and bury them in rubble and put them under hills. This is a map of his commission, and um, the whole conspiracy is Brown was responsible for all of this, and there's absolutely no way he was responsible for all of this. At the time, he was making millions of dollars a year. Um, it was a parliamentary effort. Um, the what's this? Yeah, all of this artificial, all those trees. Um, Ingenious. Some of the earth moving techniques they had were ingenious. Places like this, so there's so many conspiracies now that we get sucked into. Mud flood being definitely one of them. And this is like, well, what the hell is this? Well, this is ingenious. When the water would flood and say something like this, it would need to come out something like this down the way. So they used a lot of absolutely ingenious engineering. Um, and there's evidence of the military being involved. So when you have military engineers showing up on these job sites, and anytime, like we know this now, anytime DARPA is involved with something, something should be going on. So knowing that the military was involved back in the day in the removal of an entire history, um, this gets actually even crazier because there were parliamentary acts. Here's a great picture. This is a very old structure, and this was demolished and buried. And this is history that was completely buried and grown over. And even in this picture, how weathered this structure was. In some situations, he might leave like one wall sticking out of the ground, but just to make it kind of have like that surreal effect. So to get an understanding of the vastness of it, they had 6 million plus acres, or 1/5 of the total country of England that they manipulated. So these people changed the earth and altered the history and displaced the population. So all these people that lived out there, I mean, think about these were literally our ancestors who were living in the woods, in these communities, in these societies, minding their own damn business. Um, and the interesting thing is, um, that there was the nationwide operation to do this. But when you think about it, the Industrial Revolution that they needed people for. So they displaced rural working people and they put them into cities because they needed more labor to build and um, you know do the Industrial Revolution. um, 1 second. So lots of villages. When you think about that scale, think about how many villages were in this area, and people getting displaced, and the rewritten of history. So, you know, So there were laws that were passed, parliamentary laws. They did one called the Enclosure Act, and basically what they did was they removed the people. So not only could the states, the we'll just call them the one percenters, the elites of the day, not only did they take the land, they made sure that they had an envelope around the land that nobody could go to. So they virtually took away their land. The land surrounding the sites were no longer belonged to the common people. Their rights of access were removed, and the fields were enclosed by hedges, walls, or fences. Um, let's go back. So in 1773, that's when the Parliamentary Act came in and actually made it so the nobody could even see. So basically, Parliament and made an act that made it so these people had to leave their properties, leave the areas, and not only that, they closed the roads so nobody could see what's going on in there. So like the government was involved, the military engineers were involved. They were in such a huge hurry to bury and rewrite history. They really wanted to get these people out. They did this in 100 years. In 100 years, they basically reshaped the country, and basically that was part of the rewriting of our history. And when you think about his story and them write history, well, you also need to have the architecture, the literature, the and the landscape to kind of go with it. If they're going to rewrite history and they're going to say one thing, but the buildings say another, people are going to be suspicious. But people now, you walk around, you walk around this, you think this is normal. You think this is how it's always. You would think this was God's gift to obviously this wealthy person's view. You think this was God created this environment when thinking this tree was planted by some guy in 1750 as a sapling. The other thing is they moved a ridiculous amount of trees. So some trees can transplant quite well. Some of these trees with really deep tap roots, they don't really transplant very well. So when you think about the scale of employees. I mean, there's receipts to go with all this stuff. There's like payroll that goes through all this stuff. There's, people involved. There's names of people that did all these things. And it's really been a pretty big cover up. So this kind of gets us into mud flood. This looks like a cover up. This looks like a cover up. We've always kind of, you know, we think of the cyclical cataclysm. We think about, oh, well, this makes perfect sense that a cataclysm would happen, excuse me, and wash Earth and cover the Sphinx. Like that makes sense. Um, these guys on their channel, they theorized that all these things were kind of being exposed at the same time, right around the same time, and like why wasn't this seen before, or why was this so buried, and so there's lots of evidence of them changing the landscapes and seeing what these guys Capability Brown did in this landscape, knowing that this is just artificial and it takes up 1/5 of the country. You can see how easy it would be for them to change history, kind of all over the planet. And really, what it comes to me is we've been tricked time and time again about our history, and no one would ever think this was not natural unless we actually had the evidence of it. So when we think about now, Agenda 2030, Agenda 21, they want to get people out of the rural areas and get them into mega cities. What would it take to make where I live or where I used to live rurally in the mountains non-existent, so someone in 200 or 300 years wouldn't know? And you can actually see it wouldn't take very much, and it would take time and people. And what we know now about human ingenuity and what humans can build, um, look at these structures. Like look at this house. Humans built this. Like I think a lot of times we think about things and we forget like humans built these mega beautiful structures in Europe and these gorgeous cathedrals and these just blowing things that these were actually people like us, and it's hard to comprehend. So just knowing how easy it is for them to erase history or change history, they just take a building like this and freaking bury it, and then now there's no evidence of it. And so there is evidence of it, and all you got to do is start digging. Um, what they've done in the UK, they've started digging and they found where they built or where they buried these structures. And so, what caused this? Did humans bury this in, or was there an actual event? And if that event happened, where's the documents of it? So I guess that's kind of the end of it's not the end of it, it's end for this conversation, but I think it's just the beginning of kind of like looking at things from a slightly different perspective.